I'm going to share those words as I read the same poem that you all so beautifully just sang. Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame with conquering limbs astride from land to land. Here, at our sea-washed sunset gates, shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name, Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that twin cities frame. Keep, ancient lands, your storied pomp, she cries with silent lips. Give me, your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. Emerald Lazarus was born in New York City in 1849. Her parents were wealthy Sephardic Jews of Portuguese descent. Her father, Moses, was a very successful sugar merchant. And he was adamant that all of his 7 children, including Emma, would receive a very complete education. So the family hired tutors for each of their children, and they learned French, and they learned Italian, and they learned German. And Emma finished her first book of poetry by the time she was 17, and I think because she was her dad's favorite, he published it for her. But her second book of poetry, which she published not long afterwards, she dedicated, and the dedication says, "To my friend, Ralph Waldo Emerson." So she's not Unitarian, but she's Unitarian adjacent, and so I feel we can kind of claim her. So she remained a prolific writer throughout her short life. I think she was only 38 when she died of an illness. But she was also, as I shared with you in the introduction, she was an activist. She didn't hide her identity. She was proud of it. She talked about it openly. She volunteered for the immigrant societies in New York that helped to welcome Jewish people to this country. She helped found a vocational school, the Hebrew, I forget the name of it, but I'll tell you in a minute, a school that offered vocational training for immigrants who came so that they would be able to make their way in this country. She traveled back and forth to Europe because during the late 19th century, especially in the 1880s and the late 19th century, anti-Semitic sentiment, which had never died or ended throughout Europe. It already had 2,000 almost years of oppression under its belt. But in Russia in particular, between 1881 and 1884, there were 250 violent riots, pogroms, targeting Jews with violence. When Tsar Alexander II was murdered, that violence increased exponentially, and everyone who could emigrated from that community, emigrated mostly to the United States. Emma put her money where her mouth was. She worked ceaselessly for the cause of immigration. She championed Zionism. She championed the notion of a homeland for Jewish people in Palestine. And she wrote the poem you just heard in musical form. And when I read it, she wrote that poem to raise money for the pedestal to hold the Statue of Liberty. And some of you may know this story. Now, the French, whose idea it had been to offer this magnificent gift of this statue to the people of the United States for the Constitution that the people here had come up with and for the work of anti-slavery and abolition. And the French were very generous in raising the money to make the statue. The people in the United States, not so much when it came to funding the pedestal. The Congress vetoed a bill that would have offered the money to finish the project. President Grover Cleveland vetoed another bill that would have offered the money that would have given the money for this project to be finished. Yeah, right. That's what I think. Anyway, it fell to Joseph Pulitzer, the newspaper man, to kind of do a GoFundMe before GoFundMes existed, and he offered to print the name of every single donor who gave anything at all, even the tiniest amount of money. And in fact, he got almost enough money to finish the project, and many, 80%, we believe, 80% of those donations were smaller than $1. And he did keep his promise, and he did print the names. And who presided over the installation and dedication when it was all finished? Oh, President Grover Cleveland. I shouldn't sound so sarcastic. It's very unspiritual of me. But it is part of the irony of who we are in this country, with mixed messages, mixed loyalties, policies that contradict one another. I'll talk more about that in a minute. President Grover Cleveland sided with white landowners in the South. He too, and was vocal with them and told them that he believed also that African Americans, newly emancipated after the Civil War, were actually really inferior people. He made this clear. He advocated very strenuously to not permit immigration for Chinese workers who had built the railroad from sea to shining sea to increase exponentially the capacity for imperialist wealth in this country. But Grover Cleveland and many in this country did not want these Chinese workers to stay and make their lives here. So first, the Congress passed fairly quickly after the 14th Amendment allowed the children of people who were not native or had not been citizens of this country to become citizens. Congress passed a law forbidding Chinese women from coming to the country. I guess the rationale was no Chinese women, no Chinese babies. But then shortly thereafter, they realized it was not enough, so they passed a complete ban on immigration from China to achieve that goal. And President Cleveland's explanation for this was they just don't seem to want to integrate in our society. So we really can't have them here. Almost in those exact words, actually. I'm not exaggerating that. So here we have, at this moment in the late 19th century, we have a number of communities of color, each of which have done backbreaking labor, substantial backbreaking labor to build the wealth that so many of us enjoy today. The enslaved people brought from Africa to work for free for so long, so very many years. The indigenous people, the Native Americans, the American Indians, whose land the colonizers took without a second thought and then sent them to reservations. The Chinese people who built the railroads that were the key to the development of the nation. The Mexicans whose land had been annexed by the United States. My friends in Texas always say, we didn't cross the border, the United States lowered the border. So Mexican agricultural laborers since the 1840s have been coming to this country, again, to provide back-breaking labor. Mostly, though, they went home to their families after the seasons were over. So there was no ban at this point, or no great kind of intervention to make sure that people from Mexico didn't become permanent citizens of the United States. So I'd like to read to you something that really struck me. This was something that the Saturday Evening Post wrote in 1920. Mexican labor fits the requirements of the California farm as no other labor has done in the past. The Mexican can withstand the high temperatures of the Imperial and San Joaquin valleys. He is adapted to field conditions. He moves from one locality to another as the rotation of the seasonal crops progresses. He does heavy field work, particularly in the so-called stoop crops and knee crops of vegetable and cantaloupe production, which white labor refuses to do and is constitutionally unsuited to perform. Does that sound familiar? Agricultural labor and construction, and actually landscaping, in this very moment, as you and I sit here, are among the three most dangerous occupations in this country. And they are the occupations that are dominated not just by migrant labor, but undocumented labor. So while the situation in terms of race, the intersection of race and policy has been with us in this nation for histories, today the picture is even murkier and darker and more dangerous than it ever was. The question I've learned to ask after many years of doing my best to be an advocate and an activist in our political system, the question I've learned to ask is this: if there is a policy or a law that seems to create vast injustice, who benefits and how? I can easily say, and we can all easily say, that all of these things I've been talking about for the last several minutes have to do with racism. And they do. But who actually benefits? Where is the power located in these equations? And beloveds, I'm fully aware that immigration is not the only area of catastrophe we are facing, but it is a very serious one. And it is one of many places where not only lives and livelihoods are at stake, but generations of families being demonized and vilified and incarcerated. So I'm going to pursue with you for a moment the question of who benefits. And many of you may already be aware of this, and some of you may not be, but in either case, it is worth repeating. I don't need to tell you who benefited from the practice of chattel slavery or the practice of taking over colonizing lands that did not belong to the colonizers. But things have become worse in many of these areas. Now I'm turning to some of the analysis of a brilliant writer, Aviva Chomsky. You may recognize her last name. Good revolutionary lineage. And she wrote a book a few years ago called Undocumented. Some of you may be familiar with it, but in my opinion, it is one of the clearest and best supported analyses of how immigration became illegal. It wasn't illegal in the 1880s, it wasn't illegal in the 1920s. She points out that in 1965, and she kind of picks out that year a little bit arbitrarily, but she points out that after the civil rights movement and liberation movements really all over the world, led by people of color, led by people from marginalized populations, after the civil rights movement, to be outwardly racist, overtly racist, was no longer quite as acceptable in the court of a public opinion. And so in order to continue these practices that prove of great benefit to private interests, this movement had to go somewhat underground. And it did. So what happened? Under Richard Nixon, who had a heavy hand in this, a war against drugs was instituted. The purpose, the stated purpose, according to one of his top advisors who later talked openly about it, was to incarcerate as many African American men as possible. As you know, still in many places, but then in most places, a convicted felon could not vote. So the mass incarceration endeavor, which continues to take place, now going on its 50th year, incarcerated several generations of black people in this country, and it benefited in two ways. One, it eliminated a voting bloc that would probably have voted more and historically had voted for more liberal candidates. But it also vastly enriched the private prison industry. Who else benefited? Well, if you have license plates or any number of other goods, you also benefit because, as many of us know, free labor is used to create many goods and services. So when Michelle Alexander wrote her book and kind of blew the lid off of that particular practice, I don't think, I know, it was folks in our government, folks in the leadership of our nation, folks devoted to private interests, came up with the notion of expanding the private mass incarceration project to Latinx people from Mexico and Central America. There are two major for-profit prison companies in this country. GEO is one of them, CoreCivic is another. I believe it is CoreCivic whose profit in 2023 or 2022 was $1 billion from ICE contracts. Your taxes go to pay a daily stipend for every undocumented or suspected Latinx immigrant who is incarcerated for every day that they are incarcerated. The other company, a similar 30 to 40% of their profits come from incarcerating quote unquote undocumented immigrants. The idea that immigrants are racist or thugs or rapists, or thugs or whatever, those ideas serve, the racist ideas serve the agenda, but they are not the agenda. And why am I repeating all of this for those you know, or why am I saying it now? Because with all my heart, beloveds, with all my hearts, I believe that we who believe in freedom shall not rest, right? We sing that song, right? We who believe in freedom. The Unitarian Universalist Association was the very first religious denomination in this country to promote sanctuary laws. We have a history of promoting justice for all, including immigrants. And we who believe in freedom cannot advocate for freedom unless we understand what is really going on. And I continue to invite us as a congregation as we offer opportunities to explore racism and how it functions in our society, as we offer opportunities to learn more about immigration and other issues that are hidden behind the scenes. I invite you to join that conversation. The more we know and the more we learn, the more we can practice our faith in the world. And if a young Jewish woman activist can help get the Statue of Liberty done with her poem on it, we can probably get something done too. Amen, dear ones. Ashe, and blessed be.